Good evening. There we go. Welcome to Hoyt Sherman Theater. I'm Judy McCoy Davis. I'm a member of the Library Foundation Board, and I want to welcome you here on behalf of the library and the foundation. The Library Foundation is so proud to support this program that truly celebrates the written word and authors who write and all those who love to read. This series is funded because of all of you. It's through the private funds that are raised for this particular program that we're able to have this kind of program. And to that end, I want to remind each of you that there is an envelope in your program. Take it with you. And think about making a donation to help support these programs, because it's only because of the generosity of you and other donors that such programs exist. We'd like to give special thanks to those sponsors who've given specifically for this series and who have made in-kind donations for it. Those would include Humanities Iowa, the Des Moines Art Center, Wells Fargo, Deborah and Douglas West, Hoyt Sherman Place, Nationwide, the Forest Avenue Brick Fund, Drake University Center for Global Citizenship, the Iowa Council for International Understanding, and the Iowa History Center at Simpson College. Let's clap for those donations. I'd also like to thank the volunteers who are helping us tonight. Mary and Bill Dunbar, Carolyn Nelson, Judy Mousakis, and Carolyn Lawerence. And a little bit of housekeeping. I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phone or put it on to vibrate. Also, you're asked to complete the evaluation form that's in your packet before you leave tonight. After the presentation, there will be a brief question and answer session. We ask that you write down your questions on the paper provided and pass them to the end of the rows at a specified time. Lastly, I would like to remind you that after the presentation, Lawerence books can be purchased, and he will stick around to do signing of these books. Please note that he has shared with us his signing rules. It's in your program. He will sign any and all books that you purchased tonight, and he will sign 2 books that you've brought from your collection for every copy of Step by Step that you buy tonight. And of course, there's AViD t-shirts for sale as well for $10, and they can be purchased after the program. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for tonight, Jean Meyer. Jean was appointed as a Commissioner of Public Safety the Commissioner of Public Safety in January 2007. He's an Iowa native. He began his career as a communications operator for the Iowa Department of Public Safety, and he was promoted to Assistant Director of the Division of Criminal Investigation in 1989. 5 years later, he was chosen to head the newly created Gaming Bureau, and he became the Director of the Bureau of Criminal Investigation in 2003. But in addition to that, he has been a frequent contributor to his community, our community, and it's for that I'm especially pleased to introduce him, because he was mayor of West Des Moines for 10 years. And as you may know, I have a soft spot for the position of mayor and understand how hard they work. And during that time, the valuation of the community increased from $2 to $5 billion. He was an excellent public servant. He continues to serve on boards and commissions and has served on such boards as the Greater Des Moines Partnership, the Metro Advisory Council, Greater Des Moines Visitor and Convention Bureau. He has his undergraduate degree in criminal justice and his master's in public administration. He's a 1980 graduate of the Federal Bureau of Investigations, the FBI National Academy. And please join me in welcoming Jean Meyer.
Thank you very much. I'll have a little fun. Boy, that was far longer than it needed to be. You know, it's my pleasure to be with you this evening, and thank you for coming out on such a beautiful, beautiful spring evening in Iowa. Like you, I'm very anxious to hear from Lawerence Block and have him talk to all of us and then listen to him answer a number of your questions. I listened to him on Iowa Public Radio earlier this week, and I also observed him on the Craig Ferguson show. I don't know if this is his first time. Well, I know it's not his first time in Iowa because he did a race in Fort Dodge in 1981 for, I don't know why, but he was in Fort Dodge, and he also set out, to walk several places and visit many buffaloes, places named Buffalo. I don't know if he made it to Buffalo Center, and I don't know if he'll address that. But I've had a chance to visit with him backstage. He is true to form. He's wearing his tennis shoes. I was going to wear mine, but I don't have a dress pair. So I'm just up here in my regular shoes. But as you all know, because you're here to listen to him, he's widely recognized in the genre of mystery and suspense. And I've decided I know about half as much as he does. I know a lot about mystery, little or nothing about writing. But he spent a number of years living in New York. When he's not writing, he enjoys traveling. But after listening to him the other night, he also enjoys Michael Caine movies. He's married to Lynn. He has 3 daughters. As you know, he's received numerous awards for his work, including being named the Mystery Writer of America's Grand Master, 4 Edgar and Shamus Awards, and a recipient of prizes in France, Germany, England, and Japan. His latest novel, Step by Step, a pedestrian memoir, chronicles a year in the life of an aging race walker. Included in the book is a description of the time and effort put forth in competing in marathons. Additionally, he's added some childhood and adolescent memories in the novel. It's my great pleasure, and it's going to be my great enjoyment to join you as we now get to hear from Lawerence Block. Please give him a warm Iowa welcome.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. Though I must tell you that I feel a little bit like Madonna's latest boyfriend. I know what I'm supposed to do, but I can't figure out how to make it interesting for you. It's hard to know exactly what to talk about. And Gene was no help at all. I said, what should I talk about? He said, talk about 40 minutes. So we'll try to fill the time. As you know, I'm here with a book called Step by Step, which is indeed a memoir and set out to be the story of 1 year in the life of an aging and not particularly talented race walker. And as I started writing, I found myself wandering far afield, which occasionally happens during races as far as that goes. And it became a more complicated book, a more elaborate book, a more extensive book than I had expected. And I thought I would start by reading a bit from it. I know it's been my observation that readers like it when writers read from their work. And I've never understood why. I found it baffling for the longest time. And then it struck me one day that you want to see us read because you want assurance that we can. And once I realized that, it made perfect sense to me. I mean, why should I read the thing if he can't, Makes sense. So I'll start by reading. I'll start actually, curiously enough, I'll read a section from the beginning because it's quite about memoir and the whole experience of writing it and the whole notion of memory. And I'll have to take my glasses off to do that, which is another reason that I like to read because, let's face it, I look so much more dashing without them. I've been a professional writer for 50 years, and with the exception of 4 instructional books for writers, virtually everything I've written has been fiction. I did turn out several pseudonymous works of purported nonfiction, ostensibly psychological case studies, but they were entirely fabricated, fiction in sheep's clothing. So this is a departure for me. In the pages that follow, everything I've written is as it happened. I realize that this no longer seems to be a requirement in memoirs, that some memoirists apparently feel free to let their imaginations improve on reality. But when I want to use my imagination, I sit down and write a novel. A memoir, it seems to me, should confine itself to what the author remembers. Clearly, this doesn't matter to everyone. When I expressed contempt for one such imaginative memoirist, a contempt shared by Oprah Winfrey, my daughter Amy couldn't understand why I was getting so exercised. Maybe he made some of it up, she said, but I have to say I found it very entertaining. Right. And that Hitler? Say what you want about him, but the guy was a hell of a dancer. So I've stayed with what I remember and have avoided doing anything to improve it. My father couldn't tell a story without exaggerating, aiming to make a better story of it. That always bothered me, and I've always erred in the other direction, hewing to the line of the literal truth. As best I can. Memory, you see, is an artful Ananias. I've become deeply suspicious of those cases in which a suppressed memory, recovered decades after the fact with the aid of a brilliant hypnotherapist, has resulted in an indictment for child molestation. Even conscious memories, I've found, are overly cooperative witnesses, quick to tell you what you want to hear. And isn't it remarkable how the same therapists keep on dredging such memories from one client after another? Sometimes my memory's a liar. Sometimes it's merely asleep at the switch. I'm not inclined to trust it unequivocally, and yet I have to if I'm going to write about early times. Whom else can I consult? I tell the story, for example, of a walk I took in 1949 with 2 friends, Jerry Karp and Rhett Goldberg. At least I'm pretty sure those were my 2 companions. That's how I remember the incident. I can't ask Rhett. He's gone, dead of cancer for more than a decade now. I could ask Jerry. We're still friends, but would he remember? And if he did, why should his recollection be any more reliable than my own? And does it really matter who accompanied me on that walk downtown? Here's an example of dueling memories. In 1960, I was one of half a dozen people who established a weekly poker game for small stakes. Most of us were writers, honing our skills and earning a marginal living writing paperback trash. And one of us came up with the idea of combining the 2 activities to our mutual profit. Suppose, say, half a dozen poker-playing writers assembled at someone's home. 5 would play cards, while the 6th went off to another room and wrote a chapter of a novel. When he was done, he'd return to the game, and another player would go write a chapter, and so on. Twice around the circuit would give us 12 chapters, and that's all we needed. By dawn, if all went well, we'd have a book. We'd present that book to our agent, Henry Morrison, a poker player himself, and he'd peddle it to our publisher, and we'd divvy up the proceeds. It would be the first poker game in the history of the world where everybody would come out ahead. What could possibly go wrong? 6 of us assembled at Mel Fox's house. Mel, Don Westlake, Dave Foley, Hal Dresner, Bern Fone, and myself. Someone shuffled the cards, somebody dealt them out. And one of us went upstairs and sat down at the typewriter. I don't remember who went first, but I do know that Hal, Don, Dave, and I were the first 4, and each of us wrote our chapters with all deliberate speed and put them out of our mind upon returning to the game. Then it was Bern Fone's turn, and he had a request. He was not that sanguine about his ability to stay awake all night, and not much of a card player anyway, So how would it be if he wrote both his chapters at one stretch and then went home? We all agreed that would be fine, and he went upstairs and got to work. And it didn't take very long at all before he came downstairs with not one but 2 chapters completed in record time. We wished him the joy of the evening, though it was probably morning by then, if you want to be technical about it, and he headed home while Mel, our host, climbed the stairs to take his turn. And time stopped. It was hours later when Mel finally staggered downstairs and the rest of us discovered the problem. Byrne, concerned that he'd fall asleep at the poker table or the typewriter, had tried to stack the deck by ingesting a handful of amphetamine. That almost certainly had a good deal to do with the pace at which he knocked off his assignment, but it also scrambled his brain beyond recognition, and the 2 chapters he'd produced were gibberish. Grammatically correct gibberish, perfectly typed gibberish, even highly literate gibberish. But the story got lost completely, and nothing on the page made a particle of sense. That was only half the problem. And if Hal or Don or Dave or I had been scheduled to follow Byrne, all would have been well. The 4 of us were old hands in the world of softcore porn and would have quickly concluded that Byrne's chapters would be fine for lining the parakeet's cage, but for nothing else, and would have tossed them and picked up where he'd started. But Mel was the group's neophyte, and it never occurred to him to question the work of a veteran like Byrne. So what he tried to do was write the next chapter and do so in a way that would make logical sense, and all of that was plainly impossible, which is why it took him hours on end and why he ultimately came downstairs looking as though he'd sustained a massive concussion. That was pretty much the end of that. Dawn had broken, and so had our spirits. We cashed in our chips and went home. Years passed, several of them, during which time Dave Foley came down with leukemia and died at a lamentably early age. And at some point, we disinterred the partial manuscript. We got rid of Byrne's chapters and Mel's heroic attempt at their sequel, and Don and Hal and I took turns adding chapters to what was left until we had, if not a book, at least a book-length manuscript. We gave it to Henry, who sold it to our regular publisher, Bill Hamling, and every cent of the proceeds, $1,000, $1,200, went to Sandy Foley, Dave's widow. It was our understanding that Scott Meredith, Henry's employer, didn't even take a commission on this particular sale, and that, I have to tell you, is the single most implausible element in the whole affair. All these years later, I recall nothing whatsoever about the plot or characters of that book. It must have been published, but I never saw a copy and never learned what title it bore or under whose pen name it appeared. Were I to read it now, and I must say I hope that never happens, I doubt it would ring the faintest of bells. While the book as a collection of ill-chosen words has essentially vanished without a trace, it lives on in legend. As an experiment in literary collaboration, it was an abject failure. But its anecdotal value was far more than adequate compensation for all concerned. I don't know how many times I told the tale over the years, and so did Don, and so did Hal. But none of us got anywhere near as much mileage out of the story as another fellow. He, like Henry, worked as an agent for Scott Meredith. He, too, was a frequent player at our weekly poker sessions. And although none of us knew it at the time, he was supplementing his agent's salary by writing pseudonymous books for Hamling. He may have kept this last fact a secret to avoid the appearance of conflict of interest. I won't embarrass him by telling you his name. He's a fine fellow, an able literary agent, and on balance, one of the world's good guys. And I have to say, a superb raconteur. He tells the story of our poker game novel in great detail and with great enthusiasm. In his version, he was one of our number at Mel Fox's house in Queens, an avid participant at the poker table downstairs, an able hack upstairs at the typewriter. But see, he wasn't there. He couldn't have been, for Christ's sake. We didn't even know at the time that the son of a bitch was a writer. Did he simply figure it made a better story if he put himself into it? Or, as one theory about O.J. holds, had he told the story his way so many times that he came to believe it himself? I don't know and I don't care. I know he wasn't there. He may or may not know he wasn't there. At this stage, indeed at any stage, what earthly difference does it make? Ah, well. I've had to make a particular effort to avoid overusing such phrases as "if I remember correctly" and "to the best of my recollection" and "as I recall." The reader can take them to be an unvoiced preamble to every incident I recount. So, everything that follows is the truth, as far as I can tell. There's one other thing I ought to tell you, although you'd probably figure it out for yourself in short order. This book is self-indulgent. It seems to me that comes with the territory. How could a memoir be other than an exercise in self-indulgence? One writes it sustained by the assumption that a record of one's own experiences and observations will be of interest to other people. This assumption often proves to be unwarranted, which may explain why such a high percentage of memoirs are self-published or not published at all. For my part, I found that the only way I could manage to write this book was to let it be every bit as self-indulgent as it wanted to be. It is, to be sure, a record of my experiences as a walker. If the book itself were a walker, it would be an ambler and a rambler, not terribly intent to racing to the finish line, and inclined to turn off on any path that looks inviting. Remembering, I've discovered, is curious work. The memory is a house in which there are many mansions. Enter into one of them and a hidden door can spring open, luring you into a portion of the past you haven't visited in years. But there it is, and you slip inside, and another door opens. Thank you. That poker game has really attained mythic proportions over the years, and has slipped into into contemporary mythology in a curious way. I've had people come up to me and say, "I understand that you once a week, a batch of you would get together, play poker, and write a book." You know, as if thousands of books were produced this way. This happened once, and we were not stupid enough ever to try it again. Yeah. Let me think what else I can tell you about the book. As I recount in the book, I first began running when I was about 38 years old. And I'd never done anything notably athletic before then. And the idea of running had never occurred to me before then, unless there was a bus that I really needed to catch. And I started gradually and doggedly. And after having done so for a certain number of months, I found myself entering a race and ran for several years. I ultimately was to do 5 marathons in 1981, in addition to, I forget how many other races, but probably about 35 or 40 other shorter races as well. And somewhere in the course of all of this, I damaged my knee enough so that running became problematic. And that made me take up race walking as an alternative, and I did that for several years. And then I stopped, as I recount in the book. And, it's often said that running, or walking, as you will, is addictive. It's described as a positive addiction. People talk about endorphins and the runner's high. And I must say that I don't know that I've experienced the runner's high, but if that's what it was, the description, the label for it was invented by someone who didn't really know how to get high. someone who spent the 60s in a cocoon. Ah, yes. But running may indeed be addictive, but what I was to discover was that it is nowhere near as addictive as not running. It takes quite a while to develop an addiction to running. It takes one day to become addicted to not running. And so I stopped running sometime running, walking, doing any of that sometime in 1982, and didn't get back to it until 2004, at which time I got back to it and ultimately wound up doing marathons and ultramarathons, and indeed, I forget the number, but I think there were 4 or 5 24-hour races. You may not know what a 24-hour race is, so the clever ones among you will figure it out by the name. I know a friend of mine reported that he got home and he told a friend, he said, yes, I just completed a 24-hour race. The guy said, great, what was your time? There is a 24-hour race located in eastern Iowa. I forget the town. But it's called the Corn Belt Race. It's held sometime in May, and it's held on a quarter-mile track, which you just go around. The likelihood of forgetting the route is very... Nobody gets lost at Corn Belt. And I'm told that I think it's every 4 hours they turn you around, and if you've been going clockwise, they turn everybody around and have them go counterclockwise for 4 hours, and so on, for fear that otherwise people will wind up with one leg shorter than the other. It could happen. Anyways, so I got very much back into walking, and that was what made me want to write a memoir. In fact, what happened first was that I wrote an extended race report for a web group of distance walkers, and it struck me that might be a book that I would want to write, and so indeed I did. And as I was saying, I wound up including a lot more than I had thought I would. I wound up writing about childhood and adolescence, which were things I never thought I would write about. My inclination in writing has always been to write fiction, and not autobiographical fiction at that, to write imaginary stories about characters that exist only in my own imagination. It's a way, I suppose, to express oneself without revealing oneself, which I'm sure is what I had in mind. Let me read another portion, I think. How are we in time? Yeah, I think I have time for this. This is a taste of I write some about the most wonderful trip my wife Lynn and I ever took, which was a walk across Spain on the pilgrimage route, the 10th century route from the south of France to Santiago de Compostela. Writing has always been to write fiction, and not autobiographical fiction at that, to write imaginary stories about characters that exist only in my own imagination. It's a way, I suppose, to express oneself without revealing oneself, which I'm sure is what I had in mind. Let me read another portion. I think. How are we in time? Yeah, I think I have time for this. This is a taste of I write some about the most wonderful trip my wife Lynn and I ever took, which was a walk across Spain on the pilgrimage route, the 10th century route from the south of France to Santiago de Compostela. And, well, I'll just read a little. Where I pick up was when Lynn and I were attending a festival for crime writers in Spain. In Madrid, we and 40 or 50 other American and British crime writers boarded the Andalusian Express, a luxurious private train that took a full day to carry us a couple of 100 miles north to the industrial port city of Gijón. The ride was quite wonderful, and somewhere in the course of it they served us lunch, and we shared a table with Don and Abby Westlake. And Don, looking out the window at the Spanish countryside, told us about a friend of his named Jack Hitt, who had some years ago walked across all of this terrain to follow the course of an ancient pilgrimage over the Pyrenees to the city of Santiago de Compostela. There was this route, we learned, and pilgrims had walked it for over 1,000 years, and they were still at it, schlepping from village to village in the sacred steps of St. Francis and St. Clair, and there were refuges for pilgrims where you could stay, and Lynn and I were sitting next to each other, with Don and Abby seated side by side opposite us. I remember this because I remember that there was a point in the story where Don paused, for breath or wine or whatever, and just then Lynn and I turned as one so that we were looking right at each other when we said, in a single breath, "We've got to do that." In the first week of May 1991, Lynn and I flew from New York to Toulouse in the south of France. We stayed overnight at a hotel, and in the morning we hoisted our backpacks and started walking south. We were on our way to Santiago de Compostela and intended to arrive there by the 25th of July, because we knew that pilgrims ideally reached the city by that date to celebrate the Feast of St. James. We also knew that the traditional pilgrim route led through the French border town of Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port and its Spanish counterpart, Roncesvalles. But we decided to take a different route over the Pyrenees so that we could walk through Andorra. We'd never been to Andorra, and this seemed like a perfect opportunity to add it to our list. And so we walked out of Toulouse and on toward Andorra. I don't know how far we went the first day, or indeed on any of the days during that first week. We walked to a cafe and got something to eat, and then we walked until we found a hotel and took a room. And we got up the next morning and did it again. We must have been out of our minds. Our preparation for the pilgrimage consisted of a single lunch with Jack Hitt, the fellow who told Don and Abby about the whole business in the first place. Jack turned out to be a splendid fellow with a great supply of anecdotes and a fine sense of local color, but all that lunch really did was convince us to go. And so we'd gone, without reading a single book about the pilgrimage in modern or contemporary times, without doing a lick of research, and without undertaking any training for the physical ordeal we were about to undergo. We were living in New York now. We had moved back just over a year ago on St. Patrick's Day in 1990. And as New Yorkers, we were, of course, in the habit of walking a couple of miles a day because that's how one gets from place to place. And I joined a gym upon our return and got there 2 or 3 times a week, working with weights and dutifully slogging away on the Stairmaster. Lynn assumed walking would be no problem. After all, she'd been doing it all her life. I figured it might be slow going at first, but that we'd get stronger as we went along and would eventually be able to take the physical side of the trip in stride, so to speak. Some long city walks during the month before our departure probably would have been a good idea. They'd have been good practice, especially if we'd worn our backpacks. But we didn't even have backpacks until a week before we set out. We bought them in a rush one afternoon, along with a pair of sleeping bags and a tent. We took back the tent the following day, having realized it was just going to be too much to carry. And it's a good thing, because otherwise we'd have thrown it overboard sometime during the first week in France. Even without it, our packs were too heavy. I don't know what they weighed. After the first day, mine was the heavier of the two because we shifted much of the load from Lynn's backpack to mine. That was essential because I was stronger and better able to manage the weight, and because she'd brought more stuff with her. We'd both kept clothing to a minimum, but she'd brought along her full complement of Erno Laszlo skin preparations, and those little jars weighed a ton. So my backpack was the heavier of the two, but both of them were heavier than we'd have liked. The clerk had tried to sell us aluminum-framed backpacks, and they struck us at the time as cumbersome. If we'd taken his advice, we'd have been better off. Our packs weren't designed to distribute the weight, and the straps cut into our shoulders. Before long, Lynn decided her backpack was the problem. It hurt, it tired you out, it slowed you down. There was, she realized, a far better way to transport one's possessions. "I want a shopping cart," she announced. I had the hardest time trying to explain to her why this wasn't a good idea. It did no good to point out that people who did this sort of thing all the time always wore backpacks and never pushed shopping carts. All that meant to her was that she'd thought of something that hadn't occurred to anyone else. A loaded shopping cart, I told her, would be very difficult to push up a hill. And it would be at least as hard to hold on to on the downhills. And it would probably lose a wheel or fall apart altogether before too long, because those things were designed to move at a leisurely pace up and down supermarket aisles with no surface under their tires more abrasive than a parking lot. They didn't roll up a whole lot in the way of mileage, and none of it was apt to be on dirt roads or trails, but I wasn't getting anywhere. Several times a day she'd resume whining about the shopping cart. Everything I told her was the truth, and what good did it do me? So I switched to fiction. Maybe a shopping cart wasn't that bad an idea, I told her, but it just didn't sit right with me. See, I'd be deeply embarrassed to be seen in the company of somebody pushing a shopping cart. "Oh," she said. "Oh, okay." Because once it was a question of style, she could accept it. The first day out of Toulouse, it rained some, but after that the weather was pleasant and the days were not without their satisfactions. Each night found us at a 2- or 3-star inn, and the rooms were comfortable and the meals more than acceptable. The walking gave us an appetite, and afterward we didn't have trouble sleeping. In the morning we'd have breakfast, and then we'd reclaim our passports from the desk and set off again. One morning, after a night in a very nice inn in the town of Foix, we omitted the reclaim our passports step. That was my job, and we'd walked the better part of an hour before I realized my error. I left Lynn at the side of the road, shucked my backpack, hurried back to Foix, collected the passports, and hurried back to Lynn. She sympathized with me, having to do all that extra walking, and I told her it hadn't been so bad. It was a nuisance having to cover the same ground again, but at least I hadn't had all that weight on my back. And before she could put in another word for shopping carts, I sympathized with her, having to stand around all that time. It was okay, she said. I didn't have the backpack on, and I didn't have to walk anywhere. I could just sit in the shade. It was very pleasant, actually. Let me see if there's a little more to me. I'll read a little bit more. It was during our transit of Andorra that Lynn first began to believe that she'd actually be able to go the distance. Up until then, she figured that what she was going through was only going to get worse, and that eventually she'd have to quit and go home. The only thing that was keeping her going was that she couldn't figure out how to break the news to me. I knew she was having a tough time, but I'd anticipated as much. I was having a difficult time myself, contending with the weight of the backpack and the steepness of the terrain and the sheer burden of mile after mile after mile. What kept me going was the certainty that it would become easier once my body had conditioned itself to meet the challenge. I could recall those laborious circuits of Washington Square Park, by means of which I had gradually turned myself into a runner. In much the same fashion, I was now transforming myself into a hiker, and so was Lynn. Except she didn't know it. And when I told her, she didn't believe me. As far as she was concerned, I was just shining her on, dangling the notion of improved physical conditioning like a carrot, while I kept in reserve the stick of disapproval. She didn't believe me for a moment. It was just a nice story I was telling her, something to lure her into continuing this impossible journey. And if I could make up such a story, she could pretend to believe it. But she wasn't buying it, not for a minute. So she soldiered on, knowing it was hopeless, and sustaining herself by holding imaginary conversations with her girlfriends, in which she pointed out my obduracy while lamenting the fact that she couldn't go on and didn't know how to tell me. I wished she'd had some of those conversations with me, because as it was, I really had no idea what she was going through. Then again, what if she had? All I could do was offer the same assurance I'd been extending all along, and all she could do in turn was nod and smile and know in her heart that I was full of crap. So on we walked, and I wondered why this game and good-hearted companion had morphed into a whiner, while she wondered why she'd ever been persuaded that marrying me was a good idea. And then somewhere in Andorra, things changed. I don't suppose it hurt that we had crested the Pyrenees and that we were now going down instead of up. But more important was the fact that the walking we'd been doing had made us discernibly stronger. I think, too, that the strengthening process was mental as well as physical. What kept you going? She gave me a look. And a mile or so down the road, she found us a shortcut. We were approaching Andorra la Vella, the principality's capital and largest city, and the road into town consisted of an elaborate series of descending switchbacks. From where we stood, we could see the town way down below, and the way the road resembled a meandering river, or perhaps a snake. Lynn pointed to our right, where a steep and little-used footpath plunged straight down toward the center of town. "Come on," she urged. "We can go straight down and save all that walking." And so we did. Staying upright was no mean task, given the declivity of the path and the heft of our packs, and it was almost as hard to keep from running as it was to keep from falling, but we managed somehow. And it was exhilarating, dashing down that mountainside, crossing and recrossing that winding ribbon of road, and finishing up, flushed and breathless, in the very center of town, surrounded by no end of establishments eager to sell us cigarettes and stereo components. "See," she said, "it was a shortcut. Wasn't that great?" "The best part," I said, "is that we're still alive." That was fun, and look at all the walking we saved. It was a shortcut. A rabbit shortcut, I agreed. It was not our last rabbit shortcut, although it was certainly the most dramatic. Lynn, who, as you might gather, is not a slave to convention, would often choose a direct if untried route rather than walk in the footsteps of others. Sometimes we saved a few steps. Sometimes we had to turn around and walk back, persuaded of the wisdom of those who had gone before us. But whenever my companion fixed her sights on a rabbit shortcut, we always gave it a shot.
Will your new book be on Kindle soon?
Step by Step is already on Kindle. At least that's what it says on the Amazon page.
Okay. Well, this next question is kind of interesting because in doing a little research about you, I know that a lot of times as you pick places and names, you just use atlases. But this question is, did you come to Des Moines to do research on hit and run?
No, I'd been to Des Moines a couple of times, so Keller came here and hit and run, as I guess you know, yeah. But no, I didn't do any further research.
I just want you to know, as the previous mayor of West Des Moines, I'm glad you made the murder occur in Des Moines. And the jeweler, I think, was in Urbandale, as I recall.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the intended hit target did live in West Des Moines, but he lived.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Why did you decide to end Small Town the way you did?
Asking me why I did anything is a fool's errand, I'm afraid. And I certainly don't know why I make certain decisions when I'm writing a book, and probably wouldn't explain them if I did.
I was also taken by the way you described a run walker, and this question leads to that. It says, what is the proper race walk form?
I'm the last person to ask about proper form because I don't really have it, but I'm sure a Google search will lead you to a YouTube thing with people race walking properly.
And
there are a variety of requirements for race walking in order to avoid disqualification in an Olympic event or anything like that. And I talk in the book about one of the inherent problems of the sport is that if you're going fast enough, you're almost invariably technically running. The two things you have to do, the knee has to be locked at a certain point in the stride, and you cannot have both feet. One foot must always be in contact with the ground. I told that to a group of people once, and they said, does it always have to be the same foot? No, that's optional. and periodically at international events and that, people will be disqualified because if you're going really fast, it's hard to have both feet always in contact with the ground. And in fact, they amended the rule and said both feet must be in contact with the ground to the naked eye. That's a lousy sentence. It makes it sound as though somebody's getting his eye stepped on, doesn't it? You know what I mean. In other words, if you run a motion picture camera or a tape recorder and you can examine frame by frame, with the fast walkers, there'll always be an instant somewhere along the way where both feet aren't on the ground. That's more than you wanted to know about that, isn't it? I thought so.
I wasn't going to stop you. Now, here's kind of a serious question. What words of encouragement can you give a starting writer with one finished novel and no agent?
I'm not sure it's morally defensible for me to encourage any new writers. It's a very difficult enterprise you've gotten yourself involved in, as you may have already begun to suspect. All I can suggest is, keep at it if keeping at it is what you want to do. At one point, I just adopted a policy of telling everybody, not to bother, figuring that the ones who were going to get anywhere wouldn't pay attention to me, and the others might be saved a little grief. But it's difficult. On the other hand, I can't think of any other way I could have happily spent the past 50 years.
Somewhat of a similar question. What would you advise someone who is about to begin writing? other than don't?
That's sort of the same question, isn't it?
Yeah, well, now this one, I guess the other person had already written a novel. This individual obviously is just thinking about beginning. What would you advise someone who is about to begin?
Have fun. In fact, that's what I advise anybody at any stage, is to have fun with it, and write primarily to please yourself, not to please some creature of your imagination, the public or the agent or whatever.
We'll change topics a little bit. Have you done much walking in Iowa? I know you raced in Fort Dodge in 1981, but have you done much walking in Iowa, and if so, where?
No, I haven't. I think I said something about this on Craig Ferguson's show a couple of nights ago, and that's that I feel a little bit under false pretenses, in that here I've written this book about walking, and I haven't been doing any of it to speak of for some months now. And in fact, I think I said this on the air, that I feel like one of those poor bastards that goes on The Biggest Loser, drops 150 pounds, goes home, writes a book about how he did it, gains it back with interest, and waddles around on a book tour saying, "This is how I did it." You know, I'll have to get back to him.
I either read somewhere or heard you say that self-reflection and self-revelation you found to be far more difficult than mystery writing, but this question deals with how does memoir writing differ from mystery writing?
Well, it's very different. It's very different. And some of that I probably answered in the first section that I read. But there are other ways that it's different too, and that's that when I'm writing a novel, if I say Keller walked into the room at 10 o'clock, he did. No argument. I don't have to check anything. If I say so, it's true. Here I have to remember what happened. It's very different. Very different. Now that I'm writing about my own life, in a sense, I'm no longer in charge.
One of our members of the audience wants to know, is Keller done for? Is Keller done for?
You know, I think it's the way things bounce. It's extremely difficult for me to hear you.
Is Keller done for?
Is Keller done for? Oh. I don't know. I don't know whether there'll be more. I don't know if I'll be writing any more fiction as far as that goes. Well, I suspect I'll be writing short stories, but I may have come to the end of a long novel writing career. I don't know if I feel like doing it anymore. So we'll see.
You said that you enjoy writing screenplays, and you've done some of that, and you hope to do some more. What do you enjoy most about that?
Well, I enjoy it some, and this past last November, I was down in New Orleans on a writing trip. I went down there to work, and I adapted one of the Matthew Scudder novels for the screen. And it was on spec, and I don't know if anything will come of it. But I enjoyed the work. It was challenging, it was demanding, it was certainly not easy, but it was material I'd already developed in that I was simply adapting to another medium, and I enjoyed the doing of it. And I felt at the time that I would probably like to do some more of that, but I don't know if that'll happen. I certainly don't want to do more of it on spec. So, you know, if something comes of this screenplay, I might do some more screenwriting.
You just mentioned Matthew Scudder, and we have a question here. I don't know what this says about who wrote the question, but the question is, do you ever see Matt Scudder falling off the wagon, as I prefer his character, when he drinks?
It's very interesting. Every once in a while, someone tells me that they really prefer Scudder when he drinks, and I always have the feeling that they've told me rather more about themselves than they have about Scudder. Since I don't even know that there'll be any more books about Scudder, I certainly don't know what the future holds for him.
And one of the members of the audience would like to know who decides to put a book on tape.
Who decides to put a book on tape? Well, the publisher of the book generally controls the audio book rights to it, and either has a division of its own that does that sort of thing, or sells the rights to one of the audiobook publishers. And that's how the decision is made. I did make one decision of my own a book or two ago, and that was that I would no longer allow abridged audiobooks made from my books. And you know, this is late in the game, and almost all of them that do exist as abridged audiobooks, but I just don't want to be a part of that anymore. If I'd wanted the thing to be a third of its length, that's how I would have written it in the first place.
Well, I think we'll conclude the evening. The last question is not a fair question, only because you said you're not sure you
great.
have a...
Let's have an unfair question.
Yes, have well, it is, because you said you don't know if you're going to write another novel, and so this question is, tell us about your next book. So, I was going to just repeat, on behalf of everyone here, what Craig Ferguson said to you on television, and he's a big fan of yours, as everyone else is here, is that we want to urge you to continue writing novels. And we very much enjoyed having you here.
Well, thank you. I guess.
You guess. Anything else? One up there. Go ahead.
You had said you have become good friends with Craig Ferguson. How did this friendship come about?
Oh, how did Craig and I become friends? It started off because he liked the books, and he got in touch and invited me to be a guest on his show. And I've been back 4 times since then, and we've gotten together a couple of times in New York, and yes, we've become friends. He's a wonderful fellow, and remarkably capable. I don't know if you watch the show regularly, but his monologues are just brilliant. They're, you know, he does indeed have a writing staff. Everybody in that business certainly has to, but he just goes with it and wings it and makes remarkable connections very, very deftly. He's also a very accomplished writer. His novel, From Between the Bridge and the River, is a wonderful book, and he's got a memoir coming out about his decision to become an American citizen. I think he calls it American by Choice.
Okay, we'll take one more question. Go ahead.
I got about half of that. What was the second half of the?
How did you come to enjoy writing fiction and creating characters? What writers may have influenced you?
Oh, gee, I don't know what writers influenced me. I read a lot of people early on. When I was in high school, I was reading. I can't call it adult fiction because that means something else nowadays. Grown-up fiction, the master realists of the first half of the 20th century, and I just read, a whole lot of different people. It's hard to know, whom to hold responsible for the way I turned out.
Okay, well, I think on that note, we have a T-shirt for you that we would like you to wear proudly as you walk across this nation.
I certainly will.
And thank everyone for joining us this evening.
Excellent. Thank you all.